Welcome to you all who have joined our webinar. We're going to get started in just about a minute, and I just wanted to let you know at the start that we are recording the webinar and we'll be posting it to the EE-linked website, and I'll give you that URL later in the presentation, just so you know that if for some reason you have to step out and you would like to be able to hear the full webinar, or if you have other colleagues who might be interested in the webinar, you would be able to share that with them. So now that it's 1 o'clock on the Pacific Coast, at least, which is where I am, I'd like to officially welcome you to the webinar that we are presenting today. It's going to focus on the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education, which is an initiative of the North American Association for Environmental Education. And I would like for each of the presenters just to introduce themselves briefly so that you get a chance to hear our voices and connect a face and a name to each of our voices. My name is Bora Simmons, and I am the director of the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education.
And I'm Yash Bhagwanji, an associate professor of early childhood education at Florida Atlantic University.
Hi, my name is Pilar Tucker. I am assistant director and a teacher at Faith Lutheran School in North Palm Beach, Florida.
Excellent. For all of the participants on the webinar, we wanted to give you just a very quick tour of the Adobe Connect site, just so you knew sort of what was happening. As Kim Skinner had asked in the chat a bit earlier about noises and whether she had to worry about noises on her end, and basically we have set this webinar up so that it's really only Yash, myself, and Pilar who are able to speak. So that's just because of the technology and problems with echoes and all of those sorts of things. But as we move along, if you have comments or if you have questions, please take a moment to look at the bottom of this first column on the left of your screen, and it's a chat room. So basically you can put in a question or a comment there, and we'll try to answer them or respond to them as the webinar continues on. One of the things that I would like to note also for you is across the top of your screen, you're going to see a black ribbon. And one of the options is that there's a little person with their hand up. And you can pull that down, and you can signal to us to speak louder, or if you happen to think that something that we say is particularly funny, you can laugh, those kinds of things. So if you would like to interact with us or other participants in that way, please feel free to. One of the other little bits that I'd like to point out to you is on the chat function. At the top of that chat screen, there's a little pull-down screen that you can adjust your text size. And since I am a part of the over 40s crowd, I tend to want to adjust my text size a little bit larger so that I can actually read the screen. So that may be helpful to you. You can also adjust your color of the font and those sorts of things if you wish to. And finally, I just wanted to point out, in terms of understanding a little bit about the site, is that you can send a private message to anyone. You can send it to one of the presenters, so to myself, to Yash or Pilar, or you can, if you see someone in the participant list that you would like to send a message to, you can just roll your cursor over that. There should be a little pop-up menu that says start a private chat. You can do that, and you can send a message to that person. So there may be somebody that you recognize or somebody that you would like to uh, send their, your email to or ask for their email. That's a way of doing it privately. So that's just a very quick bit of orientation to the Adobe site as we move along. And one of the things that we wanted to do was sort of start this off with getting a little bit of information from each of you. This is the 6th in a series of 5 webinars. I'm sorry, we have done 5 previously, and this is the 6th of the series of 6. And we'd just like you to click on the most appropriate piece here. Have you participated in any one of our webinars? And if you have, if you could indicate which one. So we originally did one that was an orientation or introduction to the whole project. We did one that focused on the environmental education materials guidelines for excellence. The third focused on excellence in environmental education guidelines for learning, the K-12 set of guidelines. The fourth in our series focused on guidelines for the preparation and professional development of environmental educators. And then the fifth, our last one or most previous one, was non-formal environmental education programs, guidelines for excellence. And of course, if this is your first in the series, if you could just click none, which seems to be where a lot of you sit, which is great. Welcome, and hope that you enjoy our webinars and begin to understand a little bit about our project and this particular set of guidelines that we're going to talk about, because this one is going to focus primarily on our early childhood environmental education program guidelines. So to get that started, one of the things that I always love to do is to honor and basically point out that we have gotten some wonderful funding and sponsorship from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and we're currently part of a U.S. EPA funded national EE training program that is housed at Cornell University, and it's called EE Capacity, and that has allowed us to conduct these webinars. Over the years, we've also had a number of other partners and continue to have wonderful partnerships with agencies such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, National Environmental Ed Foundation, a number of the state environmental education associations. And I happen to highlight LEAF here because both YASH and PILAR are in Florida, and that's their state environmental education association. But we've also had great partnerships with organizations like Project Learning Tree and the Arbor Day Foundation, particularly around these early childhood environmental education guidelines, and groups like Project Wild and Keep America Beautiful and Project WET, and a number of other organizations around the country and around the world. So at this point, so that we can get a little bit better idea of who you are and a bit of your background, if we would like to ask you to answer just a couple of simple questions. And we recognize that questions are always really simple, but where do your programs mostly take place? So you can only answer one way. So urban areas, suburban, rural areas. What's the most, I guess, most likely place for your programs? And it's looking like kind of a nice split. It looks like this is kind of like the horse race. The suburban areas are coming ahead here, but so split between the urban is hitting right about 22%-ish, suburban about 53, and then the rural areas in there also. So thank you very much for giving us that information. And one more poll for right now to give us a bit more information about your background. If I could ask you that what type of educator you consider yourself to be. So are you an early childhood teacher or administrator? Are you a K-12 classroom teacher or administrator? A non-formal educator that would include informal for the folks who are at zoos and aquariums? Or do you teach at the college or university level? And it's looking interesting. So it's looking like a heavy grouping of the non-formal educators, so about 77% or so, and then a nice grouping of early childhood teachers and administrators. Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to give us that little bit of background for us. What I want to do is give you a bit of a just sort of overview of the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education before we jump into the early childhood guidelines themselves. The North American Association for Environmental Education is the sponsor of this project, and we're really all about promoting excellence in environmental education, and that's the theme really for these guidelines. We have developed them through a broad range public participation process that we like to think builds off of our collective wisdom about what works and what's important for environmental education. And what we've really tried to do over the years with this project is to engage educators in a deep discussion about quality environmental education practice and what that means and how best we can improve our practice and build environmental education as a profession. As I mentioned earlier, in sort of subtly in the poll that I asked you about if you had participated in earlier webinars, we have produced a series of publications that look at the sort of guidelines, the notion of helping people think through their practice, helping people think through what it means to be an environmental educator and how we should be building our materials, how we should be building our programs, what we should be doing as practitioners ourselves to improve our own practice and our own understandings of environmental education and education in general. So we've developed 5 of these different publications, and the one that we're going to be focusing on today is the last in the series, or at least the most recently published in the series, and it has to do with early childhood environmental education programs, and we're trying to lay out this notion of what are some guidelines, what are some key characteristics of early childhood environmental education. And just to get a sense of how familiar you might be with the guidelines, if you could just complete yet another poll to tell us a little bit about your level of familiarity. So very familiar, you've read them, maybe you've used them, somewhat familiar. I'm guessing that that's kind of well, you've looked at them, maybe you haven't delved into them quite all that deeply, and not familiar, you're here today to actually learn a little bit more about the guidelines. And it's looking like we're pretty well into the somewhat familiar to not familiar at all category, which that's great, and we certainly hope that by the end of this webinar you'll know a bit more about the guidelines and how they can be a useful tool for you in your programs. So the early childhood EE programs, Guidelines for Excellence, they are recommendations for developing and implementing quality programs. We're focusing on ages 3 to 6 years old, even though early childhood certainly goes from birth up through 8-year-olds. And again, they were developed through this broad-based comment process, participatory process. And one of the things that I want to point out with them, particularly given that there were a large number of folks on this webinar who are non-formal educators, as well as a nice chunk of folks who are working as early childhood educators, is that these guidelines were developed with both of you in mind. They were developed for the person who's working at a zoo or a museum or an aquarium or a nature center who periodically works with early childhood. You might work with centers, preschools. They may be bringing very young children to your site. You may be working with very young children because of your family programs. And we wanted to provide some guidance for you as you develop those kinds of programs. But as you'll learn later, there are also lots of people out there who work at or have developed and sponsor preschools or daycare centers that work directly with these young children on a daily basis. And these guidelines were really developed for centers, for preschools and centers too, to help people think through those various issues about early childhood environmental education. The guidelines are the
Or
guidelines are.
can I interrupt?
Yes,
Can you do a check to
absolutely.
make sure everybody can hear well?
Yes. How about we do this? If you can hear us well and that the sound is going fine, because it looks like Celeste is having some problems, go up to that little guy up in the black ribbon, and if you could just check the agree button, and that way we can see if others are able to hear us, because it would be a real bother if we were going through all this and nobody could hear us. Okay, so it's looking like people can hear us. Okay, it is green. Made sure my speakers are on too. Yes. Thank you, Celeste. Yeah, one of the things you do have to obviously make sure your speakers are on. And not that this, for somebody who can't hear my explaining this isn't going to help you a whole lot, but sometimes it is your internet connection. So Alana, you say that your audio is choppy. That's possibly your internet connection, because this is being done as a voice over internet protocol like Skype. So you might want to go back out and come back in and see if that helps. And it's just one of those classic problems with technology. Hopefully, if it's really, really bothersome to you, you would be able to watch it on the recording. So let's continue on with the presentation. I hope that people are doing well and being able to hear us, but it is important for you to give us that feedback through the chat function. So let me give you just an overview of how the guidelines are structured, so that when you have a chance to actually dig into them, you have some sort of sense. They're broken down into what we call key characteristics. There's 6 key characteristics. And then Each of those key characteristics is broken down again into what we call guidelines, and each of those guidelines helps support that main key characteristic. And then there are indicators that give you a little more detail of what you might want to look for if your program was addressing the guideline, or if you were looking at another program or you wanted to develop that guideline in your program. We also have numerous boxes of examples throughout the set of guidelines and references so that you would have a chance to read further about early childhood environmental education or any of the different pieces to it. This is just a snapshot of one of the pages. So again, it starts with having a key characteristic. The first one happens to be about program philosophy. Then there are guidelines that start to address different components of the key characteristic, what to look for, those indicators. And here's just a little tiny box example of things that might be going on. Or
Laura,
relevant to. Yes.
we have two people that have raised their hand.
Okay. And can we figure out why you have raised your hand? Okay, I think if you could, folks, if you could uncheck your green button, if you did that, and then we might be able to see if there are specific questions or concerns that we should be addressing.
Kim wants to know if there's a way to download and print the PowerPoint presentation.
Ah, that's a very good question. And there really isn't at the moment. But what I will do is I will promise you that I will post it on something called EE-Linked. And I will send you all if you registered for the webinar and I have your email address, I will send you a note that tells you when and where you would be able to access that up on the web. So I promise to do that for you. But a great question. And the same thing about the publications, Kim, is that we have up on EE-Linked, and I'll be showing you that a little bit later, where you can access all of the publications and download them for free. They're all in PDFs. So let me just sort of run through and give you a high gloss overview of the guidelines. There are something like, there are the 6 key characteristics, and there's over 30 guidelines and lots and lots and lots and lots of those indicators, the what to look for. So obviously I'm not going to give you all of the detail. You would be bored to tears, and I think I would probably be bored to tears also. But let me just give you some of the kind of overview. The first key characteristic has to do with developing your program philosophy, your purpose for environmental education at the early childhood level. So here we're talking about making sure that it obviously has a focus on nature and environment, and obviously an appropriate focus on the young children you're working with, cultural appropriateness, and make sure you're really thinking about that and addressing that in your program philosophy and in your practices. One of the things that I particularly like is the notion of interpersonal and intergenerational relationships, and making sure that you're thinking seriously about those, because they're important for the children and how they develop their understandings of themselves and each other, and the community, and they become sort of members of a community. And obviously 1.5 there, health and safety, and how you address health and safety is something that goes throughout all of early childhood programs. The second key characteristic is, in a lot of ways, the heart of early childhood education, and certainly early childhood environmental education, because it's developmentally appropriate practices. It's thinking seriously about that infant or that toddler or that 5-year-old and what's appropriate for them. It's your practice, we're suggesting, should be based on research and theory. The importance of authentic experiences and providing authentic experiences for the children so that they can explore and discover and discuss their experiences in the environment. The notion of being child-centered and child-directed is incredibly important, and that it's addressing the whole child is part and parcel to developmentally appropriate practices. And if you want to learn more about developmentally appropriate practices, we certainly outline them and talk about them a lot in the guidelines, but you may also want to take a look at NAEYC, which is the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and it's referenced in the guidelines because they really do pull together the literature and the research on developmentally appropriate practices. Our third key characteristic is all about play and exploration and making sure that the adults are providing appropriate opportunities for children to get out into the natural world, for them to be able to explore, for them to be able to play, and having ample times to be able to explore their world. And also bringing the natural world indoors for them to continue their exploration and play. The fourth key characteristic outlines, in essence, a curriculum framework for an environmental education program that we hope is developmentally appropriate for young children. So it's really getting into the idea of providing opportunities for young children across social and emotional, physical, and cognitive domains so that they are growing socially and emotionally through your programs because you're giving them those opportunities, that they're developing curiosity and questioning, that they're developing age-appropriate environmental understandings and skills, and a personal sense of responsibility and caring, again, at a very age-appropriate level, and that we're providing them opportunities for physical health and development, including, lots of opportunities for the development of both fine and gross motor skills. The fifth key characteristic gets into this notion of making sure that in all of this, we're providing the appropriate places and spaces for young children so that they can explore, so that they can have those authentic experiences with nature. So we're thinking about, different types of outdoor rooms that you can provide so that the different ages of children can have those authentic experiences with natural pieces. And we're making sure that they have ample opportunities to have hands-on experiences with loose parts, so sticks and leaves and seeds and logs and stones, earth materials like sand and soil, and that they actually have a chance to move around and work on rough ground, so things that aren't flat and smooth, and they can build all of those wonderful skills. And one of the things that's really important as you think about the spaces and places is that these places are comfortable for both the children, because that's obviously essential. If they're not comfortable, they're not going to want to be there. But it's also really important that the adults are comfortable, because if they aren't comfortable, then they're not going to be taking the children out. We want to make sure that those spaces and places are maintained properly, that health and safety are taken into consideration, and that you're modeling good environmental sustainability. And the final um, uh, key characteristic really is about the educator themselves. And what we've done is we've outlined some of the guidelines related to educator preparation so that they're able to plan and implement programs appropriately. So you can just see that, we've thought something about environmental literacy of the adult, the educator, professional responsibilities. Do they understand how to foster learning and those kinds of things? So that's just a
Laura,
very, very, yes. Go ahead, Pilar.
you also have another
Oh,
person.
gosh.
Somebody has raised their hand again.
Okay.
It's from
It looks like
Jerome has a question about
Jerome.
cultural practices.
Okay. Yeah. And in there, we do, Jerome, we do talk about the importance of integrating in cultural practices and knowing your students or the children that you're working with in particular. And some of my favorite pieces in the guidelines are actually in the boxes where we provide some examples about thinking about issues like there are communities and cultures where snakes, as an example, are part and parcel to their religious beliefs. And so having snakes in the classroom could be problematic. So just those kinds of things. There are cultures where corn is very, very important. And we sort of make some suggestions about making sure that you aren't using corn and other food products as kind of just an art material, something that's frivolous. So there is quite a bit in there that talks about trying to make sure that you are culturally sensitive as you build your programs. And I would certainly hope that those who run the preschool programs know the culture of their students quite well in their community. But it's especially those who might be coming in to provide an activity, it's important that you think about that seriously. So Jerome, that was a great, great question in here. Yeah, and I think that we're going to get a little bit into the full circle community and involving families, especially when Pilar gets a chance to talk here, because it is really important that as part of like that whole first key characteristic of thinking about your philosophy is that you are involving the parents and the children and other community members in thinking seriously about your philosophy and how you run your particular program. What I want to do is move on to introduce a little bit of what Yash is going to talk about. After we published the guidelines, Yash took it upon himself to develop the Early Childhood Environmental Education Rating Scale, which is a formative tool so that you can use it for thinking seriously about your program and how it's been developed and improve your program. So just as we have done before, we wanted to get a sense from you of whether or not people have used this rating scale before so that Yash has a chance to sort of adapt his presentation a bit. So first is that, yes, you've used it and you've conducted a self-evaluation. You worked with others at your center to conduct an evaluation of your program. And no, you've looked at it. And no, I haven't used the scale at all, which looks to be the vast majority of participants today, which we kind of expected. So I think now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Yash so he can tell you a bit about the early childhood rating scale.
Thank you, Bora. This is Yash Bhagwanji, as Bora mentioned. I was very excited when the Guidelines for Excellence in Early Childhood Environmental Education came out. I read it quite quickly. I read it a couple of times and was very impressed by the organization of the guidelines as well as the quality of those guidelines. And I immediately thought about, how can this guidelines be turned into some sort of an evaluative tool? And I had contacted Bora immediately, and she was very excited about the idea as well. And the Environmental Education Rating Scale is what was produced in January, February earlier this year. So it's a relatively new rating scale, and therefore it's quite understandable why the majority of the participants have not used it. But I hope that you will after this. It is designed for all center-based programs that have an educational component. So kind of the education is the primary kind of determinant for what I mean by all. So, and these include private and public child development centers, Head Start, public preschools, early elementary, privately owned child development centers, hospital-based child development centers, nature preschools, which primarily have nature education as their primary primary curriculum, and environmental education centers, which may have programming that they offer that focuses on young children. I was just looking at some of the chats. Okay. So far, so good. Okay, and it is based upon the 6 characteristics of the Early Childhood Environmental Education Guidelines. And I believe there are about 32 guidelines embedded within these 6 key characteristics. So what I've done is I've developed a rating scale where teams work on determining the scores for each of the guidelines, and this is based on a consensus process. Now, I won't be going in detail about the identification of the team, the development of the team, how do you maintain the team over time. It is as Bora mentioned, these resources are on the NAAEE.net website. And it's free at no cost, so it can be downloaded at any time. But what I ask you to do is not to print it if you can, but just use it on a computer if it's all possible to save paper. It is rather long. It is about 80 pages long. Okay. Now here are the 7-point scales, for each of those guidelines in the Guidelines for Excellence. Each team member would read the guideline, look at the examples, and then determine if their program, where they would score any of their program. Where would they score on the guideline? I'm sorry. So 1. That means a rating score of 1 is when no discussions have been had. 2 is discussions have been initiated, but there has been no practice of it yet. And you can see so on and so forth. So there are kind of three clusters there: not implemented, partially implemented, and fully implemented. And fully implemented is when the practice is widespread and has been in place for some amount of time. Okay, and then I've developed a couple of the resources that are within the rating scale, and that is a program profile that programs or teams can use to determine the average score for each characteristic and identify strengths and areas needing improvements. And that program profile will also be helpful in determining priorities. Now, the program profile is also important if you do it on a regular basis. If, say, your program decides to conduct the formative evaluation once a year, so the program profile gives you the average scores that you have obtained during each year, and what you hope to see is that the average score increases every year. But of course, reality happens, so it's potential that for each guideline you may be moving up and down. So really, it's really a useful way of kind of keeping track as you conduct the evaluation on a regular basis. And then the other resource developed and is embedded in the rating scale is a recommended program action plan. And the plan provides a process for identifying outcomes that you want to achieve, the steps in achieving those outcomes, responsibilities, resources, supports needed, and timelines. And I have the examples next. Here's an example of a program profile for the first key characteristic. So what you do at the top is identify the date and indicate kind of the score, and then what you do is it takes you to the process of kind of calculating an average score, and then you can plot it out too. And the next one is an example of how the team that can engage based on their program profile and identify the strengths of their program related to that characteristics, areas of improvement that may be needed, and possible priorities. Now, of course, these will be based on these. Where in the graph where you have the low points, that are of course areas that you need improvements, and the high points are where you have, those are your strengths. Martha, the rating scale is about 80 pages long, but you'll see that you will not need to make copies of the entire rating scale. Okay, I'll carry on. Okay, and here is the suggested format for the action plan. You'll identify the team members, your program name, and the date it was created. The priority area, and that, what I mean by the priority area is the guideline area. And then what you will do is you will identify your team's action plans will result in. So, being very concrete in how you describe that. And then delineating the steps, who will do what will be needed, when will it be achieved, and some of the evidence that will be collected. I'm so sorry, some of you are having audio problems. Okay, and this is just technical information about the rating scale. Usually this is always part of the parcel and package and parcel of describing assessment tools. So I had almost 50 subject matter experts contributing suggestions and recommendations during the validation phase, and then during the reliability phase of the study, 17 programs had contributed data for the internal consistency. And the internal consistency of each of the guidelines is very good. It's at least 0.8 for exact agreements and at least 0.85 for within one agreements. And I'm ready to let Pilar describe how she has used the rating scale, unless people have questions. Okay, mostly it's audio problems. Okay, Pilar, I'm ready for you.
Okay, sorry. I'm at Faith Lutheran School in North Palm Beach, Florida. We used the rating scales last summer, and the first thing I noticed was the fact that our philosophy lacked talking about or mentioning early childhood environmental education. That was the first thing we did. So from there, we set up a committee. The first thing when we did the rating scales, I set up a committee of a teacher from each age group. We have 180 students ranging from infants through 4-year-olds and then an after-school program. Each age group of teacher had a teacher in it, and I took one from each age group and several parents, board members from our board, and administrators. We all went through the rating scales. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, you're coming through fine.
Okay, thank you. And we went through the rating scales and went from there, got us a score, and decided to come up with an action plan. We decided to rewrite our school philosophy to include environmental education. We wanted to provide more field trip experiences for the children in environmental education. One of the main things is the professional development of our staff, purchase books and materials for nature exploration, and provide experiences relevant to their children's environment through learning themes. We live in South Florida. We wanted to add more things about South Florida. A question was curious, what size was the team? Teachers, parents, administrators? We had probably about 10 to 15 people.
Now, Courtney, the team doesn't have to be that large. It really is dependent on the people who are leading this initiative to conduct the formal evaluation. It is really their call who they want to invite to be on the team. But ideally, it should represent multiple perspectives. So there's really no set rule for the size of the team.
Okay. The next thing we did is we took the children on a nature walk so that we could collect items that they could use in the classrooms and other things. We made posters for our walls out of them. We gave them cameras to let them take nature pictures from their point of view. And we also provided natural materials to investigate and experience. They also could use these items as art projects and backgrounds. We are going to be working this summer on a container garden to help with the growth. We provide lots of books that are in bags to send home with the children so that the parents can be involved with them and learn them. We also give the parents a list of all the nature areas around us so that they can go experience some of the wonderful wildlife we have here. Any questions?
Pilar, can you tell them just a little bit about your school in terms of the age ranges that you're working with, the type of community, the children?
We have about 130 preschool age on down to infants 8 weeks old. We have 50 school-age children that come to us after school, and we also have summer camp, which we are in right now. During these activities, especially during summer camp, they go on field trips almost daily. The children, we are more in a more affluent area, so, but we do have, as we call, subsidized children.
That's great. Thank you. And there is a question here for you from Tina about what funding sources you've used for the changes you've made in your program, or whether that just got folded into your normal activities.
It basically got folded into our normal activities. I was fortunate enough we are part of the Quality Counts program in South Florida in our county, and therefore we get funding from them if we get a certain rating scale. So we can use these items, purchase this money to purchase items for our program. I've purchased a lot of things myself just because I wanted to get it started. The main thing is to get the teachers trained so that they can understand why we need to use environmental education in our classrooms and outdoors. We have provided in-service training for our teachers, 15 hours last December, and one of our times was where we had a guest speaker who trained us in the Growing Up Wild program through Project Wild. I have also gone to the training for agriculture in the classroom and Project Learning Tree to get the early childhood information. I'm going to try to set that up sometime this fall to have our teachers also go through the Project Learning Tree.
That's great. Thank you, Pilar. And Marta is also in South Florida, and she's wondering whether or not you would be up for having visitors come to your school. So the two of you might want to have a little private chat of
Okay.
Sharing email addresses or such, or phone numbers.
Sure.
So
no problem.
That's great. So what we want to do is just let you know, I've included it in the chat, but if you would like to learn more about the guidelines in general and the guidelines project, be able to download materials, be able to download both these set of guidelines, the early childhood ones and the rating scale, you can simply go to eelinked.net/n/guidelines. And you'll be able to poke around and download all sorts of good and wonderful things. This is just a page, a snapshot of one of the pages of the early childhood piece. So you can see that we have the complete set of the guidelines. You just click on the PDF icon and it'll download. We have a slideshow. It's not this particular slideshow, but it's one that just provides a general background to why early childhood environmental education and an introduction to the guidelines, and then a summary of the guidelines. We also, on here, there's the posting of the rating scale. But I also mentioned that the rating scale is available directly through the NAAEE website too. So it's just, you can get it in multiple places. We want to make sure it's easy. So if you just go to naaee.net/publications, you can download it directly. And again, it's free. We really try to make sure that these tools are available to folks. And what I wanted to do was just mention one other initiative for those who might be interested. We are in the process of developing another set of guidelines that is going to focus on community environmental education. And if you are interested in that, Akima Price is heading up the initiative, and this is her email address. You can just simply email her if you are interested in becoming involved with the effort. And we'll be making sure that as we come up with drafts, that people are made aware of how they can access those drafts and how they can have input into the process. We're hoping to have a first draft out sometime later this summer. So we've answered some of your questions as we moved along, either through the chat or verbally. So this is just an opportunity. Are there other questions or comments that people might have? Let people wait just a little bit because of it takes time to type things in. We always know that it takes time to type things in. It's not the easiest of technologies, but it does allow you to give us a bit of feedback or to ask any questions or share any resources that you might have. Got a couple of different people in there typing, so I'm going to wait a bit. While they're typing, I want to point that we have NAAE has a conference this fall in Oakland, October 10th through the 13th, and Oakland, California. And just so you know that we are going to be hosting or facilitating a 4-hour workshop on the Wednesday, which is October 10th, I believe. And it's going to be a hands-on workshop that introduces people to this set of guidelines, to the early childhood EE guidelines. But it also will introduce you to the Project Learning Tree Early Childhood Activity Guide, as well as some materials that Arbor Day Foundation is involved with. So it's kind of a chock-full hands-on workshop on early childhood EE. So I would encourage you to come to the conference, even if you can't come out to our workshop, but you certainly, we'd love to see you at the workshop too. Okay, so there's some pieces that people are sharing, different resources. Janet shared some information about Bioneers, which is a great organization, and others are sort of making just some general comments. So somebody, Marta, is going to be presenting at NAEYC in Atlanta in November. And depending on funding, hopefully I'm going to be there too to present some information about the early childhood EE guidelines. I'm almost positive that Arbor Day is going to be there with some of their early childhood initiatives too. So NAEYC is a great organization if you're focusing on early childhood. Lots and lots of enthusiasm. Any other questions or comments as we're kind of coming up to the top of the hour here? People are typing. Mm-hmm. This is always one of those awkward points, the silence, but we know people are doing things. Pilar or Yash, do you have any last comments while folks are typing?
Well, I just want to encourage the participants to use the rating scale, see how it works. It's meant to be used as a formative evaluation tool, so, it's not a summative. It's meant to be used on a regular basis, so I encourage everybody to use it.
That's great. Yeah, the whole notion behind the guidelines is that, and all of the sets of guidelines, is really about helping us think through what we're doing. and what we're doing right and how we can improve our practice, because there's just wonderful, wonderful programs that are out there and people are doing great things. And it's always great to be able to step back and reflect a little bit about your practice. The guidelines gives you some of that, the hints of some of that reflection. And then what's wonderful with the rating scale is that it gives you that tool for that sort of thinking through and having a serious conversation with other teachers, with administrators, parents, community members, and such about what you're doing. And then thinking about your strategic plan, how you want your action plan, how you want to improve your practice.
Right, and
So it's
Bora, when I was doing the reliability phase, many of this team expressed great satisfaction in having those conversations. In listening to the different perspectives from the teacher point of view, from the parent point of view, so I think the team members who conduct the evaluations, the evaluation is basically conversations. They really express just amazement at the conversation.
yeah, any of these types of things where you really do get a chance for people uh, to sit down. It's a luxury. It's a wonderful luxury to sit down and think about what you're doing and how you can develop your programs. Marilyn put up a great little comment about Brookfield Zoo and some of the things they've been doing there. If you're ever in the Chicago area, you got to visit the Brookfield Zoo, and they have a great, great children's area that for young children that is just, it's hands-on, it's just phenomenal. The kids can play in water, they can play with those loose parts like, you know, pieces of wood and all of that. They can dress up like animals. It's phenomenal. I love the Brookfield Zoo. Um, and you gave me the proper name for it because I couldn't remember. It's the Hemmel Family Play Zoo. So great, folks. Thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us. And I'd really like to thank Pilar and Yash for helping out with this webinar and sharing their enthusiasm and their expertise. It's always great to hear what other folks are doing and how they're including environmental education in their practice.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all. And continue on in your great work. I will be sending out an email to everybody when I'm able to post this on EE Linked. It takes a little while for it to get archived and all that. But I will also, as requested, I will post the presentation itself, the PowerPoint, so that those who might want to get that, you'll have access to it. So enjoy, and certainly hope that I'm going to see some of you at the NAEE conference in October. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.